We saved Amethyst.
You don't think my crying was a little related to that?
Oh, Stephen, you don't have healing tears. You'll never have any real magic powers, and we don't want anything more to do with you.
So, you just finished writing your completely original and unique high fantasy adventure story. You now have a world just filled to the brim with different nooks and crannies all waiting to be explored. And what better character than one very energetic, if a bit naive, little boy. Yes, dear writer, you have scratched the trope that will either make your audiences sentimental and joyful, or nauseous and annoyed. You have written about the earnest young boy.
I bet there were a lot of kids who'd love to ride this bike. Whoa! Whoa!
Earnest boy is a trope I'm sure we're all familiar with. It's your Aangs, it's your Stephens, and it's your Arnolds, and many, many more. All these young boys are relatively young, between the ages of 12 and 14, and of course they're extremely close to their cousin tropes, the sad boy, the soft boy, and yes, even the sad, soft, earnest boy. But I think by focusing in on the key trait of earnestness, we can get at the strengths of the trope and why I think it's so popular, specifically in genre fiction. You see, genre fiction can come with a lot of unmentioned hurdles, introducing the world, understanding the various factions of it, and how much the audience can rely on their own common sense. In literary drama, the audience is allowed to make assumptions because the work is supposed to be within their own realm of reality. But when people start shooting fire from their hands or their siblings are constructs of light, it is safe to say the audience is going to need some guidance around their world. And this is where we get to our first perk. The earnest boy is normally excited by the unknown, even if it can be a bit naive.
I did it! I made fire! Now that's firebending!
But that exact indulgence can be a useful tool for writers to utilize in explaining the constructs of their world. In our post-video essay academic elitist world, it can be extremely obvious to viewers when the writer is doing a lore dump onto the viewer, that no real character work is really happening, and instead we'll just have a mentor explain how the power system works. But having a character ask questions and show interest can be a key component in maintaining that engagement with the viewer, because there's nothing that can take the viewer out of an experience than not having the proper conveyance of the world building. Of course, engaging visuals and well-acted dialogue enhance the experience, but those are more compounding variables for this trope.
These pools are like our chakras.
So, chakras are pools of spiraling energy in our bodies?
Exactly.
But I won't be able to come back to the temple. What if I have questions? How will I talk to you?
But did Mom really do it? Did she really shatter her?
She had to. Destroying her was the only way to save the planet. For Amethyst to be herself, for Pearl to be free, for me to be together, for you to exist.
I understand. I can already hear someone complaining that these are the most bare-bone protagonists you can have. Earnest boys are passive characters that only seek to move the plot along and grow when the plot tells them to grow. A worn trope that needs no further indulgence. Well, you're not wrong, but the complaint is a bit invalid. You see, by definition, protagonists are more often than not passive characters in a story. They move the plot along because as protagonists, the story revolves around them. And I think passive is used as a writing critique more often than I think is helpful. Mostly because the various terminology people use when critiquing works is normally reflected within the context of their own mind. So just to clarify things a bit with my own definitions, a passive character is one without a strictly defined goal, and an active character is one with a drive or urgent need. Aang, Stephen, Arnold, and Gon, and whoever fit into both of these roles at various points in the story, because without it, the story would lack proper pacing and structure. I'm sorry, we're going into a bit of a lesson about protagonists, but I'll get back to Earnest boys, I promise. Protagonists will have the most screen time in a story, that is why they can't be active all the time. If they were, then the story would feel extremely rushed, and or would leave the audience behind. But if they're only passive, it can also feel like the story is going nowhere. The reason why Zuko, in comparison to Aang, can be active all the time, is because he just spends less time on screen. They have to do more with less, and his antagonistic role allows him that. Oh, and you know what, after he joins Team Avatar, he becomes more passive, how about that? Anyway, how's all this relate to Earnest boys? Well, I think they can just balance this tone and pace between active and passive really well. I mean, their cousin trope, the sad boy, can, be a bit too mopey for a bit too long. Heck, even the extremely popular cursed soul or tragic backstory boy can just as easily slip into stagnation because there isn't much more to them than that, and the writer doesn't want to intertwine their backstory into the plot till the end of the season. But yeah, Earnest boys are a bit of a blank slate, which is fine because in a story where the world is just as important as the characters, having a character who melds with the world just seems like effective storytelling. But in this dynamic, the Earnest boy's eagerness to learn can have him go from being a passive character to immediately active, because his ability to learn feeds into his ability to act within the logic of that world. It simultaneously matures both the audience and character alike to the inner workings of the world, which is a really hard feat to pull off.
That's it! Happiness! My floating power's tied to my emotions! Right, just like all my stupid powers!
Why would I choose cosmic energy over Katara? How could it be a bad thing that I feel an attachment to her? 3 chakras ago, that was a good thing.
Of course, this can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because while this character-world relationship is good, it also means the strength of this character is totally dependent on the writing as a whole, in ways that other characters and protagonists aren't. You know, Steven makes a good example, because his relationship with the gems and homeworld clash against his desire to do right by others, thus challenging him as our protagonist. You know, compare that to someone like Rudy from Chalk Zone. Like, tell me an honest characteristic about him or Chalk Zone, other than
Rudy's got the chalk!
or he's shy, or the world is magical. There's no depth to him or the world, and they don't seek to define each other. I don't know, maybe there's some diehard Chalk Zone fans out there that I just don't know about, but for a more poignant example, like, everyone loves Kazuma Kiryu from Yakuza because he's so absurd. He's a complete juxtaposition from the gritty crime world he exists in. He's goofy and ridiculous, all while taking himself extremely seriously. And Kamurocho isn't really that interesting, nor really the villains, but boy can Kiryu's personality alone carry a plot. And there's nothing wrong with that, it's just a different protagonist with a different world. My point is that stories can have weak worlds with strong characters and the other way around, even within genre fiction. Just look at most superheroes. So, yes, I'm sure that other characters can achieve similar goals to Earnest boys, and they can be poorly written. I just don't think the trope is useless or even overused. Like I said earlier, the tragic backstory is used just as often, and while it is inherently more well thought out, it can just as easily lead to a boring resolution. If anything, it can be a unique challenge for writers to utilize a character so interwoven with their own world, as it inherently requires the character to reflect on all they have learned. It's why Aang is at his best during the later end of the season. As each season deals with him learning a separate element, his ability to learn that comes across as a bit of a lore dump, but eventually, he comes to master and manifest his own expression within each element.
I'm never gonna firebend again. I can't.
You will never find balance if you deny this part of your life.
Which also reflects on his interactions with the 4 nations, so, just standard hot take, Avatar The Last Airbender is good, who would have thought? Or, in a slightly darker story, it can also be interesting to see that exact Earnest boy lose his earnestness as a direct result of him interacting with the world. That's literally the Chimera Ant arc for Gon in Hunter x Hunter. Due to the story itself taking on darker tones, so did Gon, and in not a trite way that loses the audience's sympathy, yet gradual and obvious enough for the audience's reactions to match Killua's upon seeing his fate. Or maybe I think I just have some affection for this trope. Of course, stories don't need it, but I also think it's not as useless as people like to claim, or at least, I just think there's a lot of bad faith criticism out there. Having morally gray characters doesn't inherently make your story better, it's just another tool. Yeah, I also made a video about that. If you want to go check it out, that would be nice. And believe me, just like how I said having these characters can be indulgent in toxic ideology that I think is ultimately unhelpful, Earnest boys can also be extremely reflective of horrible mannerisms like casually bigoted behavior, or conservative moralizing, or unsolicited advice, not to mention the more gendered elements that allow this trope to be, quote-unquote, endearing. But I do think that is more about how the artist feeds into the art, which is a separate conversation for another day. So go out there, write that first draft of your fantasy or horror or space adventure, or write in one of those boys who's eager to learn about the world, and I'm sure you'll have a fun time. Just be careful to make sure you're also doing right by the world that's also being explored.
So nobody's ever noticed you.
There was someone.
Hi, nice bow. Huh? I like your bow because it's pink like your pants.
But for now, that's all I got. Thanks for watching and sharing with your friends, and I'll see you next time.